Hey guys, this is Oates here. I'm the developer working on FurryVNE, and I hadn't thought about making this video at first, but I figured there might be some questions or some confusion about the new transparency features, so I figured I might as well just demonstrate a bit how it works and how you can use it and set it up properly. So yeah, here we are. So if you go into the layers, you will notice that there is a new alpha layer that you can add. And this is fairly straightforward. You just have this alpha slider that you can drag, and when you're doing that you are affecting the alpha of, or the transparency of the object, in this case the body. And this layer works on any type of object. You can use it on the body, on garments or parts, it doesn't really matter. What does matter, however, is the technique used for the alpha. So we have two different techniques for transparency essentially. So here you're seeing one of them. And this isn't actually what you could consider to be real transparency. This is completely fake, what you're seeing right now. So this is using the same technique as on hair and fluff and the fur, which is that it's rendering the object using a dithered pattern. So what that means is that some pixels are completely opaque and some pixels are omitted or completely transparent. And by changing this pattern every frame, we can get different pixels to be completely opaque or completely transparent, and then by blending these frames together we can achieve this effect. So even though this one is either fully opaque or fully transparent, it can still appear transparent. And by doing that in a very clever pattern, we can even achieve something that resembles a transition in alpha. There are, however, some drawbacks with this, so I don't know if you can see this on the video, but for some ranges it started looking kind of bad, as you can see here. It looks a bit blotchy, and this is unfortunately a consequence of the technique used. So some values will not look so great, but other values will look completely fine, or you won't even notice that it's using this technique. So okay, now I'm going to demonstrate the other technique that we have. So this is a new shader that we have for garments and for parts. We don't have it for the body because the reason is a bit technical, and I don't want to go into too much detail about it, but essentially we need the body to be able to render into the depth buffer for other things to work in our system. And this new shader that I'm going to demonstrate on garments and on parts, it doesn't render into depth. So that is one of the reasons. But anyway, so let's go in here and change the shader of this garment. So I'm changing the blouse in this case. And you can see here, if you go into shader, that you can change to PBR transparent or SSS transparent. So these are shaders specifically made for transparency. However, you might be a little bit confused when you switch to one of these, because look what happens when I do this. Wow, what is going on here? Is this really intentional or is it buggy? This is actually completely intentional. This is a consequence of the technique used. And in this case, we can sort of fix it by just changing the culling. This is also a new feature, so we can change culling to back in this case, and that sort of fixes it a little bit, but we can still see that there are some other things going on here. And this is essentially one of the problems with using transparent shaders. So essentially there's something called a depth buffer, and that is what decides that this particular pixel, in this case for the regular shader, is going to be rendered or going to be on top of the others, rather than what happens here with the transparent shader. Because essentially what a transparent shader does is that it blends multiple pixels on top of each other, so it doesn't render into the depth buffer, but unfortunately we can get this kind of undesired effect. And this is partly due to that the triangles in a mesh are rendered in an order that isn't necessarily the best for the current viewpoint of the camera. So that means we might end up with this. But this isn't too much of a problem if you are making the object transparent. So look at what happens if I change the transparency now and by reducing it. And we can see that if I just reduce it, it isn't as noticeable anymore, and we get a really nice transparent effect. So okay, why would you use this shader instead of the other one? Well, for starters, you can actually use the whole alpha range without any blotchiness or anything. Like this shader is specifically made for that. You probably don't want to use this one for high alpha values, but rather lower ones. Another benefit it has is that, as I explained, an alpha shader actually renders pixels on top of each other, whereas if I was using the other technique for this, we would not see this. It uses dithering, which means that either a pixel is fully opaque or fully transparent, and then we're just, you know, moving this pattern around, but still, it's still just rendering the pixel that is on top of everything. So look at what happens if I change the material back to the other one. See what happens? It doesn't really, like, this part now renders on top of everything else, and essentially, even though it's transparent, we can't see through it. Like, for some people that is actually something you want. It sort of depends on what you're going for. So again, we're just offering different options here that you can use this if you want to, or you can use the actual real, in quotation mark, transparent shader. So then you get this instead. So that's up to you what you want to use. There are some more things that you should know, and that is that the transparent shader isn't actually able to receive shadows by default in Unity, but we have actually managed to get that working anyway. But these shadows don't have as nice of a shadow as the other shader does. So I'm going to show how that looks right now. So if we move this into the shadow, we will see that the garment is actually able to receive shadow, which it cannot do in Unity by default. We actually made that happen. But what you're seeing here is that the shadow is rather grainy. So where the shadow meets light, there is some graininess, and that is a result of this technique, unfortunately. But it's better than nothing, because otherwise, if we didn't have this garment would actually be as lit in the shadow as it is up here. So it's better than nothing, but it isn't perfect. So I'm just going to show what this looks like when you have the regular shader instead, and we can see that the shadow is smoother, it isn't as grainy, and it doesn't like boil as much. But yeah, it's just two different techniques that you should be aware of. Alright, so that was a rather quick and spontaneous video that I hadn't thought of making at first. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something from it. Check out our Patreon page if you haven't done so already, and I hope you're gonna have a nice weekend. Thanks, bye.